September 1st, 1939, 10:30 in the morning. Washington, D.C. George Catlett Marshall stood in Secretary of War Harry Woodring's office, wearing a white civilian suit. Deliberately white, deliberately civilian. He'd chosen the suit carefully that morning, wanting to avoid any appearance of eagerness for what was coming. Outside the windows, the Capitol hummed with its usual rhythm. Inside this room, everything was about to change. The oath took 90 seconds. Marshall raised his right hand, repeated the words, became Chief of Staff of the United States Army and a full general simultaneously. 2 ranks jumped in one ceremony, 4 stars where there had been 2. At 3:50 that morning, Marshall had received word that German tanks were rolling across the Polish border. By the time he took his oath, Warsaw was burning. The European War had begun. The American War would follow, though nobody in Washington wanted to admit it yet. Marshall looked at the papers on his desk. Personnel rosters. Unit. Assignments. Equipment inventories. The numbers told a story that terrified anyone who could read them properly. The United States Army ranked 19th in the world. 19th. Smaller than Portugal, smaller than Belgium, smaller than Switzerland. The entire force numbered fewer than 190,000 soldiers. Germany had just invaded Poland with over 1.5 million troops. But Marshall knew the numbers were actually worse than they appeared. Because raw troop counts didn't tell the whole story. The real catastrophe was leadership. The generals commanding this army were too old, too comfortable, and too stuck in the past to lead anyone into modern war. Marshall looked at their personnel files and saw what he would later call considerable arterial sclerosis. The average age was distressingly high. Their thinking was trapped in 1918. Their bodies couldn't handle the physical demands of modern combat. Their minds wouldn't adapt to the speed and violence of mechanized warfare. Within 2 years, Marshall would force out approximately 600 officers, would end careers that had lasted decades, would destroy friendships and make powerful enemies, would be accused of gutting the Army's brains, and he would create the generation of commanders who won the Second World War. But first, he had to understand how the Army had gotten this broken. George Catlett Marshall was born December 31st, 1880, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, son of a coal merchant and brick manufacturer. Middle-class family. Comfortable but not wealthy. His father's business provided stability without luxury. Young George wasn't a brilliant student. He scraped through school with average grades. His older brother Stuart excelled academically, which made George's mediocrity more obvious by comparison. The family assumed Stuart would attend the Virginia Military Institute. When Stuart chose a different path, George applied instead. He was 16 years old. V.M. I accepted him in 1897. The school was brutal. Hazing was severe. Physical conditioning was constant. Academic standards were high. Many cadets washed out in the first year. Marshall survived through determination rather than natural talent. He finished 15th out of 34 graduates in the class of 1901. His first assignment was to the Philippines. Second Lieutenant Marshall arrived in Manila in 1902 during the American campaign to suppress the Philippine insurrection. The fighting was vicious. Guerrilla warfare in jungle terrain. No front lines, no clear victories, just constant patrols and occasional ambushes. Marshall learned to lead men under conditions where leadership meant survival. He learned that orders from headquarters didn't always match reality on the ground. He learned which officers could adapt and which couldn't. These lessons would matter 37 years later when he needed to rebuild the Army's leadership. He served 15 months in the Philippines before contracting typhoid fever. The disease nearly killed him. He was evacuated to the United States in poor health, weighing barely 130 pounds. It took months to recover. Through the next decade, Marshall moved between assignments: Fort Reno, Oklahoma; Fort Leavenworth, Kansas; back to the Philippines, staff positions, training commands. He married Elizabeth Lily Carter Cole in 1902. The marriage was happy until her death in 1927, a loss that devastated him. During these years, Marshall developed his philosophy of leadership. He believed in direct communication, hated yes men, valued officers who would tell him the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. This approach would define his tenure as Chief of Staff. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, Marshall was a captain, 36 years old. He'd been in the Army for 16 years and was still a junior officer. The promotion system had frozen his career. But war changed everything. He deployed to France with the 1st Division in June 1917. Within months, his performance caught the attention of senior commanders. He was promoted to temporary major, then to temporary lieutenant colonel. He served as Chief of Operations for the 1st Division, then as Chief of Staff for 8th Corps, then as Chief of Staff for 1st Army. His work was exceptional. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, considered Marshall one of the most capable officers in the AEF. Pershing's trust in Marshall was so complete that he relied on him for the most sensitive planning tasks. One incident in October 1917 revealed Marshall's character. During a meeting at 1st Division headquarters, Pershing was criticizing the division's performance. The critique was harsh and, in Marshall's view, unfair. When Pershing paused, the assembled officers stood silent. Nobody wanted to contradict the commanding general. Marshall spoke up. He defended the division, explained the challenges they'd faced, pointed out what they'd accomplished despite inadequate supplies and support. He was respectful but firm. The other officers expected Marshall to be relieved on the spot. Instead, Pershing listened. Later, he made Marshall his chief aide. The general had learned that Marshall would tell him the truth, and truth was more valuable than flattery. But after the armistice in November 1918, the wartime promotions evaporated. Marshall was reduced in rank from colonel to captain. The demotion was standard. Millions of men were leaving the service. The Army was contracting back to its peacetime size. Wartime ranks disappeared. Marshall spent the next 15 years as a major or lieutenant colonel. He was 43 years old before he regained the rank of colonel. The system that had enabled rapid advancement during war now strangled careers during peace. He watched the same thing happen to thousands of other officers. Men who had commanded battalions and regiments in France were reduced to commanding companies or serving in staff positions. Their experience was wasted, their skills atrophied. Many of the best left for civilian careers where their talents would be rewarded. Those who stayed learned to wait, to avoid mistakes, to cultivate relationships with seniors, to play the system rather than fight it. Initiative was punished, conformity was rewarded. The The peacetime army selected for patience, not performance. Marshall watched this process with growing alarm. He could see what was happening to the officer corps, could see the stagnation, could see how unprepared the army would be when the next war came. And he knew the next war was coming. The problem Marshall inherited in September 1939 had been building for 2 decades. The promotion system operated almost entirely through seniority. An officer couldn't advance until someone above him retired or died. Merit mattered little. Connections mattered more. The mathematics of the bottleneck were brutal. In 1920, the Army had demobilized from over 4 million soldiers to fewer than 200,000. Officers who'd held temporary wartime ranks were reduced to their permanent peacetime grades. A temporary colonel might find himself a permanent captain. The adjustment was traumatic. The National Defense Act of 1920 had established the structure of the peacetime army. It set authorized strengths for each rank, limited the number of generals, colonels, majors, created a pyramid where advancement required waiting for vacancies above. But the act hadn't anticipated the demographic bulge of World War I officers. Thousands of young men had received commissions between 1917 and 1918. All entered service within a narrow window. All aged together. All competed for the same limited number of senior positions. The result was a demographic disaster that Army planners called the hump. Approximately 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire regular Army officer corps, were clustered within an extraordinarily narrow age band. These men had all entered service during World War I, received rapid wartime promotions, then watched their careers freeze for 20 years. The numbers were staggering. More than 1,800 captains were in their 40s. Over 1,000 officers whose age and experience qualified them for lieutenant colonel remained stuck as captains. 234 lieutenants were also in their 40s. These men had spent more than 2 decades at the most junior commissioned rank. The average age of captains in the regular army was 38 in 1939. The average age of majors was 46. Many lieutenant colonels were in their early 50s. By the standards of modern militaries, these men were ancient for their ranks. Younger officers looked at this bottleneck and saw no future. A lieutenant graduating from West Point in 1935 could calculate with grim precision that he'd probably be a lieutenant for 8 to 10 years. Might make captain in his mid-30s if he was lucky. Would likely never advance beyond major unless a war created massive expansion. The best and brightest left. Took jobs in industry where ability mattered more than seniority, where promotions came based on performance, where a talented 35-year-old could manage departments and earn substantial salaries instead of commanding a company for $3,000 a year. Those who stayed learned to survive, not to excel, not to innovate, to survive. Keep your head down. Don't rock the boat. Don't contradict superiors. Don't propose new ideas that might threaten established procedures. Wait your turn. Hope someone above you retires before you're too old to benefit from the vacancy. The system rewarded caution and punished initiative. An officer who tried something innovative and failed would damage his career. An officer who did nothing and made no mistakes would advance steadily through seniority. The peacetime army selected for men who could wait, who could tolerate boredom, who could accept that their skills would atrophy in garrison duty, who wouldn't quit in frustration when decades passed without meaningful advancement. These were precisely the wrong qualities for combat leadership. War requires officers who can make decisions quickly under incomplete information, who can adapt when plans fall apart, who can take calculated risks, who can inspire exhausted men to keep fighting. The peacetime promotion system had spent 20 years breeding risk aversion into the officer corps. Marshall now had to reverse that conditioning, had to identify which officers still retained the ability to lead in combat, had to remove those who'd grown too comfortable in the slow rhythms of garrison life. Marshall himself had been trapped in the same system. He'd served 15 years between 1918 and 1933 before regaining his colonel's rank. He'd been passed over repeatedly, had watched less capable officers advance through political connections, had seen the best officers leave in frustration. His own stagnation had taught him lessons. He'd observed how the system worked, how it rewarded the wrong qualities, how it destroyed talent, how it prepared the army for everything except war. In 1927, Marshall was assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, as assistant commandant of the infantry school. The position gave him responsibility for updating infantry tactics and training. More importantly, it gave him a platform to observe hundreds of officers over a 5-year period. Fort Benning wasn't just a training school, it was the intellectual center of the infantry branch. Officers from across the Army came there to learn, to teach, to develop doctrine, to demonstrate their capabilities to superiors who might remember them when promotion opportunities arose. Marshall watched them all. He taught classes himself, observed other instructors, evaluated how officers responded to tactical problems, noted who showed creativity and who simply repeated what they'd been taught. He developed a teaching philosophy that emphasized practical problem-solving over theoretical knowledge, would present officers with tactical scenarios, give them incomplete information, force them to make decisions under time pressure. Watch how they reacted when their initial plans proved unworkable. Some officers froze, waited for more information, requested additional time, couldn't function without complete data and clear guidance from superiors. These men, Marshall noted, would be useless in combat where information is always incomplete and time is always short. Other officers made decisions, might not always be right, but they acted, chose a course of action based on available information, adapted when circumstances changed, kept moving forward even when uncertain. Marshall remembered these officers, stored their names in his extraordinary memory, would recall them years later when he needed commanders for combat divisions. One exercise became famous at Fort Benning. Marshall would give officers a tactical problem. They'd have 30 minutes to prepare a solution, had to present their plan to the class, defend their reasoning, answer questions. Most officers approached this methodically, spent 28 minutes preparing, 2 minutes presenting. Their plans were polished, complete, detailed, often unimaginative. A few officers worked differently, spent 10 minutes on the problem, presented for 20 minutes. Their plans were rougher, less polished, but more creative, more willing to take risks, more likely to propose unconventional solutions. Marshall paid attention to this difference. The methodical officers were demonstrating staff officer skills. The creative officers were demonstrating command potential. Staff work could be taught. Command instinct couldn't. He also paid attention to how officers handled criticism. Some became defensive, made excuses, blamed incomplete information or insufficient time. Others listened, asked questions, incorporated feedback, demonstrated they could learn. Marshall's evaluation system was informal. He kept no written records of these observations, didn't rate officers officially, simply watched, remembered, accumulated mental notes about who might be capable of combat leadership when the time came. During these Fort Benning years, he developed relationships with officers who would later become famous. Omar Bradley served as an instructor, taught tactics with Marshall's guidance. Joseph Stilwell was there, Matthew Ridgway, Walter Bedell Smith, J. Lawton Collins. These men weren't famous yet, were mostly captains and majors, but Marshall saw potential, saw that they thought differently than most of their contemporaries, weren't content to simply follow established procedures, asked questions, challenged assumptions, demonstrated the kind of flexible thinking that combat requires. Marshall also learned what he didn't want, watched officers who were brilliant in classroom settings, but useless in practical exercises, officers who could recite doctrine perfectly, but couldn't adapt when tactical situations changed, officers who needed perfect information before making any decision. These observations accumulated over 5 years. By the time Marshall left Fort Benning in 1932, he'd watched approximately 150 future generals pass through the infantry school. About 50 had served on the faculty under his supervision. He didn't know then that he'd eventually command the entire army. Didn't know he'd have the power to select which officers would lead divisions and corps in combat. But when that power came, he'd have years of observations to draw upon. The mental catalog he'd built at Fort Benning would prove more valuable than any written fitness reports, because fitness reports in the peacetime army were inflated. Almost everyone received excellent ratings. The reports were useless for distinguishing real capability from merely adequate performance. Marshall's memories were different. He'd watched officers under conditions that revealed character. Tactical exercises that showed how they thought under pressure. Teaching assignments that demonstrated whether they could explain complex concepts clearly. Interactions with students that revealed patience or arrogance. This knowledge was irreplaceable, and Marshall's extraordinary memory meant it was always accessible. He could recall a conversation from 1928, could remember how a young captain had handled a difficult tactical problem in 1930, could recollect which officers had shown creativity versus which had simply followed templates. By 1939, when Marshall became Chief of Staff, he had 8 years of detailed observations from Fort Benning, plus memories from his earlier assignments in the Philippines, France, China, and various staff positions, plus fresh impressions from the Louisiana maneuvers. The system for identifying talent existed entirely in his mind. No little black book, no secret files, just memory and judgment, and willingness to trust his own assessments over official reports and seniority rankings. The generals commanding the army in 1939 were products of this broken system. Most had reached their positions through patience rather than performance. They'd waited their turn, avoided controversy, outlasted their competitors. The qualities that made them successful in peacetime, caution, deference to superiors, mastery of bureaucratic procedure, were precisely the qualities that would get men killed in war. Marshall had watched these officers for years. He knew their strengths and weaknesses, knew which ones could adapt and which couldn't, knew which ones would rise to crisis and which would crumble under pressure. The knowledge he'd accumulated over 3 decades would now determine who led the American Army into battle. In April 1940, Marshall testified before Congress. His message was blunt. Leadership in the field depends to an important extent on one's legs and stomach and nervous system. It depends on one's ability to withstand hardships and lack of sleep and still be disposed energetically and aggressively to command men, to dominate men on the battlefield. The generals he'd inherited couldn't meet that standard. They were too old to command troops in battle under the terrific pressure of modern war. Their minds were set in outmoded patterns. They couldn't change to meet new conditions. This wasn't theory. Marshall had studied the German campaigns in Poland and France, had seen how speed, aggression, and initiative at all levels of command had shattered larger forces that relied on methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new way of war. Their commanders made decisions in hours that would have taken traditional armies days. The generals who would lead American soldiers against such an enemy needed to think and act differently, needed to move fast, decide fast, accept risk, needed physical stamina to command from the front, needed moral courage to make hard decisions when lives hung in the balance. But removing senior officers wasn't simple. The Army had traditions stretching back to the Revolution. Officers had friends in Congress, connections in industry, classmates scattered throughout the service. Every general marshal pushed aside had former subordinates who would remember. Every forced retirement created enemies. Marshall proceeded anyway. The mechanism Marshall created became known as the plucking board, though its official name was the removal board. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 gave him the authority he needed by eliminating the requirement that promotions below brigadier general occur solely through seniority. This allowed Marshall to promote younger officers over their seniors, to push aside those who couldn't meet the demands of modern command. The board itself consisted of 6 retired general officers, deliberately retired so that serving officers wouldn't be judging their potential rivals. Marshall asked his immediate predecessor as chief of the staff, General Malin Craig, to come out of retirement and chair the board. Craig had served from 1935 to 1939, was widely respected throughout the Army. His presence gave the process legitimacy. Nobody could accuse Marshall of settling personal scores when his own predecessor was making the decisions. Marshall's instructions to the board established the governing philosophy. The mission is not to weigh a long and successful career against a failure in 1940 or 1941. It is not the function of the board to determine how good a man he has been. Rather, it is to determine the worth and value of the individual to the Army today. Critical times are upon us. The measure must be today's performance. Officers removed by the board received 1 year to retire, more dignified than immediate dismissal, but an unmistakable end to their careers. The board's authority was sweeping. It was empowered to remove from line promotion any officer for reasons deemed good and sufficient. The documented removals tell part of the story. In summer and fall 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and Reserve officers. The lieutenant colonels were the largest group. They represented the bottleneck of World War I veterans who'd been waiting decades for advancement. In the 5 years before Marshall took command, only 37 officers total had been removed from the Army, an average of fewer than 8 per year. Marshall increased the removal rate more than 5-fold. Ultimately, 500 colonels were forced into retirement. Marshall himself estimated he pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States entered the war. The scale of the purge became clear during the Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941. These massive exercises involved nearly 500,000 troops across vast swaths of Louisiana and East Texas. They were the largest military exercises in American history to that point. The maneuvers weren't just training. They were Marshall's final examination for his officer corps, his last chance to identify which generals could handle the chaos of combat before American soldiers faced real enemies. The exercises were designed to simulate war as closely as possible. 2 armies would face each other across Louisiana, the Red Army attacking from the north, the Blue Army defending from the south. Over 400,000 soldiers, 1,000 tanks, thousands of trucks and artillery pieces, aircraft from Army Air Corps fields across the region. But this wasn't parade ground drill. Marshall insisted on realism. Units would maneuver day and night. Communications would fail. Supply lines would be disrupted. Weather would interfere with operations. Plans would fall apart. The exercises would test everything. Could commanders adapt when their carefully prepared plans became irrelevant? Could they maintain command and control when radio nets went down? Could they make decisions with incomplete information? Could they keep soldiers effective after days without sleep? Marshall moved constantly during the maneuvers, drove hundreds of miles, visited command posts, observed briefings, watched how generals reacted to unexpected developments. He wasn't looking for textbook solutions, was looking for leaders who could function in chaos, who could keep their units moving forward when everything was falling apart, who could inspire exhausted men to keep fighting. The maneuvers revealed capabilities that paper records couldn't show. Some generals who looked impressive in peacetime garrison commands collapsed under the pressure of simulated combat, couldn't handle the pace, couldn't adapt when plans changed, couldn't maintain their composure when confronted with setbacks. Others thrived, found the chaos energizing rather than paralyzing, made quick decisions based on incomplete information, kept their units coordinated even when communications failed, demonstrated the kind of aggressive leadership that would be essential in real combat. One general stood out, George Patton. Patton commanded the 2nd Armored Division during the maneuvers. He was supposed to be contained by a defensive line. The Blue Army had established positions, had orders to hold, expected the Red Army's armor to attack frontally. Patton had different ideas. On the night of September 15th, he led his tanks on a wide flanking march, moved at night, maintained radio silence, drove his men hard, covered over 100 miles in darkness across difficult terrain. At dawn on September 16th, Patton's tanks burst into the town of Shreveport, captured the headquarters of Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, commander of the Blue Army, nominally took Drum prisoner according to umpire rules. The maneuver was brilliant, aggressive, exactly what German panzer commanders were doing in Europe, moving fast, bypassing strong points, driving deep into enemy rear areas, creating chaos that paralyzed defensive responses. The umpires couldn't keep up with Patton's advance. By the time they reached Shreveport, Patton's tanks had already secured the headquarters area. The umpires had to retroactively declare the attack successful. More importantly, Patton had demonstrated capabilities that paper qualifications couldn't measure. His physical stamina at age 55 was remarkable. He'd stayed in his command tank for 36 hours, had eaten cold rations, had slept maybe 3 hours total, had maintained tactical control of a division-sized force through a complex night movement. His aggressive instinct was exactly what Marshall wanted to see. Patton hadn't asked permission for the flanking maneuver, hadn't waited for perfect conditions, had seen an opportunity and exploited it. Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, by contrast, had demonstrated the opposite qualities. His headquarters had been comfortable, well organized, located in a town with good communications and accommodations, far from the confusion of the field. When Patton's tanks arrived, Drum's staff was caught completely unprepared. They'd been focused on managing the defensive line to their south, hadn't anticipated that enemy armor might bypass that line entirely and strike deep into rear areas. Drum was a capable staff officer, brilliant at organization and planning. But the maneuvers revealed he couldn't adapt when the enemy refused to cooperate with his plans, couldn't function when his carefully organized command structure was disrupted. Marshall watched all of this, noted which generals maintained effectiveness under stress, noted which couldn't handle the pace, noted which stayed close to the action, and which remained in comfortable headquarters. Of the 42 generals who commanded a division, corps, or army during those exercises, historians estimate that only 11 would go on to hold combat commands during the war. The other 31 were pushed aside, reassigned, or retired. Marshall had seen what he needed to see. The Ialiu maneuvers also revealed problems with tactics and equipment. American tanks were too light. Anti-tank weapons were inadequate. Communications equipment was unreliable. Coordination between infantry and armor was poor. But these were solvable problems. New equipment could be developed. Tactics could be refined. Procedures could be improved. Leadership couldn't be manufactured. Either an officer could handle combat stress or he couldn't. Either he could make decisions under pressure or he froze. Either he inspired men or merely commanded them. The maneuvers gave Marshall data he couldn't get any other way. Fitness reports were useless. Almost everyone received excellent ratings. Personal connections meant officers were evaluated by friends who couldn't be objective. But performance under simulated combat conditions was objective. Either a division moved effectively or it didn't. Either a general maintained control of his units or he lost track of them. Either plans adapted to changing circumstances or they failed. Marshall evaluated generals based on results, not reputation. An officer's connections didn't matter if his division performed poorly. Past achievements didn't matter if he couldn't handle current demands. Seniority didn't matter if younger generals demonstrated superior capability. The maneuvers identified both who should be removed and who should be elevated. Generals who failed were reassigned to less critical positions or retired. Officers who excelled were marked for combat commands. When the United States entered the war 3 months later, Marshall had his list ready. He knew which generals would lead the first divisions into combat. knew which corps commanders could handle the stress of modern warfare, knew which army commanders had the strategic vision to coordinate multiple corps across hundreds of miles. The Louisiana maneuvers were expensive, cost millions of dollars, disrupted civilian life across Louisiana and Texas, took soldiers away from normal training for 6 weeks. But they were worth it, because they revealed which generals could lead in war and which couldn't. Marshall could have waited until American soldiers were in combat to identify failed leadership, could have let incompetent generals learn on the job, could have hoped that experience would separate capable officers from incapable ones. But that approach would have killed thousands of American soldiers. Each failed general would command a division or corps. Each failure would be paid for in American lives. The maneuvers gave Marshall a chance to identify and remove failed leadership before Americans started dying, made the mistakes visible while they were still theoretical, allowed corrections while there was still time. By November 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor, Marshall had completed his evaluation, had identified which generals would lead combat divisions, had pushed aside those who couldn't meet the standard, had elevated younger officers who demonstrated the qualities combat would require. When the United States went to war on December 7, 1941, the Army's senior leadership was radically different from what it had been in September 1939. Younger, more aggressive, more adaptable, more willing to take risks, and more capable of winning. The men Marshall removed weren't incompetent. Many had served honorably for decades. Some had distinguished records from World War I. But Marshall applied a ruthless standard. Past achievement meant nothing if an officer couldn't perform today. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's best years were behind him. The removals followed patterns. Age was one factor. Marshall believed that division command in modern warfare required physical stamina that men in their late 50s and early 60s simply didn't possess. Combat divisions would move constantly. Commanders needed to be with their troops, not comfortable in rear headquarters, but age alone wasn't disqualifying. Patton was 54. Walter Kruger was 60. Both demonstrated physical vigor that younger men might envy. Marshall evaluated individuals, not statistics. The plucking board focused primarily on lieutenant colonels and colonels. These ranks represented the bottleneck. Men who'd been promoted during World War I and then stagnated for 20 years. Many were now in their late 40s or early 50s. Were they capable of commanding regiments in combat? Could they handle the physical and mental demands? The board's answer for many was no, not because they were incompetent, but because they'd spent too long in garrison commands, had become administrators rather than leaders, had lost whatever aggressive instinct they might once have possessed. Some officers accepted removal gracefully, understood that the Army's needs had changed, recognized that younger men might be better suited for combat, retired quietly, and supported the war effort from civilian positions. Others fought back, used political connections, contacted congressmen, wrote letters to newspapers, accused Marshall of destroying the Army's institutional knowledge, of promoting inexperienced officers over proven leaders. The political battles were intense. National Guard generals were particularly problematic. Guard units were tied to state politics. Guard generals often owed their positions to governors who'd appointed them. When Marshall tried to replace Guard division commanders with regular Army officers who demonstrated combat potential, state politicians erupted. One National Guard general wrote to his state's congressional delegation claiming Marshall was discriminating against citizen soldiers. The congressman summoned Marshall to testify, asked why he was removing officers with decades of Guard experience. Marshall's response was characteristically blunt. I am not going to leave him in command of that division, so I will put it to you this way. If he stays, I go, and if I stay, he goes. The congressman backed down. Marshall had made clear he'd resign rather than compromise on leadership standards, and everyone knew that losing Marshall would be catastrophic. Roosevelt had selected him over 33 more senior officers specifically for his ability to rebuild the Army. If Marshall quit, the entire mobilization program might collapse. Marshall used this leverage repeatedly. When challenged on personnel decisions, he'd stake his position, force critics to choose between removing him or accepting his judgment. Since removing him was unthinkable, critics usually capitulated. But the political costs were real. Marshall made powerful enemies. Officers he'd removed had friends in Congress, had connections in industry, had relatives who remembered what they saw as unfair treatment. Service newspapers ran articles defending removed officers, praised their past service, questioned Marshall's judgment, accused him of getting rid of all the brains of the Army. Marshall rarely responded publicly, couldn't explain his reasoning without criticizing individual officers by name, couldn't reveal the specific deficiencies he'd observed without destroying careers completely. He absorbed the criticism silently, let his decisions speak for themselves, trusted that results would eventually vindicate his approach. The removal of specific officers revealed Marshall's priorities. He was willing to remove officers with exceptional administrative skills if they lacked combat capability, was willing to remove officers with political connections if they couldn't lead in battle, was willing to remove personal friends if friendship clouded his judgment about capability. One colonel had served with Marshall for 20 years. They'd been stationed together multiple times. Their families knew each other. The colonel was intelligent, hard-working, politically savvy, would have made an excellent staff officer. But Marshall didn't think he could command a regiment in combat. Lacked the aggressive instinct, was too cautious, too methodical, would follow doctrine precisely, but couldn't adapt when doctrine didn't apply. The colonel was passed over for promotion, eventually retired, never knew why Marshall had blocked his advancement. Marshall never told him. Simply made the decision and moved on. This coldness was necessary. Marshall couldn't let personal feelings influence decisions that would affect thousands of lives. Couldn't promote someone because he liked them. Couldn't protect someone because they'd been loyal. The mission was too important. American soldiers would die if their commanders weren't capable. Marshall had to select leaders based solely on their ability to win in combat. Nothing else could matter. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter passed along criticism from a friend in the Army Reserve. The friend complained that Marshall was being too harsh, that good officers were being forced out unfairly. That experience was being thrown away. Marshall's response was sharp. Most of our senior officers on such duty are deadwood and should be eliminated from the service as rapidly as possible. He didn't soften his language for friends of Supreme Court justices, didn't moderate his position because important people disagreed, simply stated what he believed and continued the removals. The scale of the purge became a Washington scandal. Newspaper columnists speculated about Marshall's motives. Was he building a personal clique? Promoting officers who'd flatter him? Removing those who'd challenged his decisions? The accusations were false. Marshall was doing the opposite. Was specifically seeking officers who would tell him the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. Was removing yes men who'd spent decades learning to agree with superiors. But explaining this publicly would have required discussing individual personnel decisions. Marshall refused, maintained silence, let the criticism accumulate. He had one defense that mattered: President Roosevelt's complete confidence. FDR had selected Marshall precisely because he recognized Marshall's moral courage. The president backed his chief of staff consistently, even when politically costly. When congressional leaders complained about specific removals, Roosevelt referred them back to Marshall, made clear that personnel decisions were Marshall's responsibility. That challenging Marshall meant challenging the president's confidence in him. This backing gave Marshall freedom most military leaders never enjoy. He could make unpopular decisions knowing the president would support them, could ignore political pressure knowing Roosevelt wouldn't reverse his calls, could focus entirely on preparing the army for war without constantly looking over his shoulder at political opponents. But Roosevelt's support didn't eliminate the political costs. Every removed officer created a circle of resentment. Former subordinates who admired him, family members who saw their loved one's career destroyed, politicians who'd expected that officer to receive important commands. These resentments accumulated. By late 1941, Marshall had hundreds of enemies scattered through the officer corps, Congress, and Washington society. Many were waiting for him to fail, waiting for evidence that his promoted officers couldn't perform, waiting to say, "We told you so," when his chosen commanders lost their first battles. Marshall knew this, accepted it, made the same decisions he would have made without the political opposition, because he understood something his critics didn't. Wars aren't won by keeping everyone happy, aren't won by respecting seniority, aren't won by avoiding difficult personnel decisions. Wars are won by putting the most capable leaders in positions where they can make a difference. Everything else is secondary. One confrontation illustrated Marshall's approach. A general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to update the Army's training manuals to reflect lessons from German campaigns in Europe. He told Marshall the work would take 18 months. Marshall offered 3 months. The general refused, said it was impossible. Such comprehensive revisions couldn't be completed in less than a year and a half. Marshall asked him to reconsider, warned him to be very careful about that answer. When the general insisted the timeline couldn't be shortened, Marshall's response was immediate. "I am sorry." "Then you are relieved." The incident revealed something essential about Marshall's leadership. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. Officers who couldn't meet his standards were removed regardless of their previous service or their connections. The manuals, incidentally, were completed in 4 months by other officers. Marshall showed the same coldness toward personal friends. One general ordered to France on an important mission explained that he couldn't depart quickly because his wife was away and household furniture remained unpacked. Marshall called him personally to confirm this was his position. When the general said it was, Marshall replied, "Well, my God, man, we are at war, and you are a general. I am sorry too, but you will be retired tomorrow." The highest profile casualty of Marshall's reforms was Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, though his fate came through being passed over rather than formally removed. Drum had reached Major General in 1930, had held nearly every top position below Chief of Staff. He'd been Chief of Staff for First Army in France during World War I. Douglas MacArthur claimed Drum had virtually run the army. By every measure of seniority and experience, Drum should have become Chief of Staff. But Drum had promoted his own cause so vigorously that he alienated President Franklin Roosevelt, lobbied openly for the position, cultivated newspaper coverage, made clear his expectation that the job was his due. When the appointment was made in Damo, 1939, Roosevelt passed over Drum and 32 other senior officers to select Marshall, who was 34th in overall Army seniority. Marshall had been outranked by 21 major generals and 11 brigadier generals. Drum never forgave the slight, never stopped maneuvering for high command. During the war, he was summoned to Washington expecting to receive command of American forces in Europe. Instead, Marshall offered him the position of Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek in China. Drum objected strenuously, said the mission was nebulous, uncertain, indefinite, complained about serving three masters, Chiang, the British, and Washington. When Marshall said no large American forces would go to China, Drum remarked that he would be wasted in a minor post. Marshall concluded that Drum lacked enthusiasm for the assignment, recommended against sending him. Joseph Stilwell was selected instead. When Stilwell was asked if he would accept the difficult China command, his response was simple: "I will. Go where I am sent." Drum was relegated to commanding the Eastern Defense Command, home defense duty on the American East Coast. He reached mandatory retirement age at 64 in September 1943. Received his second Distinguished Service Medal at a ceremony where Marshall himself read the citation. But he never received the combat command he'd sought for decades. The irony is that Fort Drum in New York is named in his honor. No military installation bears Marshall's name. The removals made room for the officers Marshall believed could win the war. But identifying those officers required a different kind of talent, the ability to recognize potential that hadn't yet been proven, to see what men might become rather than what they'd already done. A legend grew up around Marshall's methods. People said he kept a little black book containing names of promising officers he'd observed throughout his career. The story was repeated so often that it became accepted as fact. The little black book never existed. Marshall's biographer, Forrest Pogue, mentioned it in his work. But when Dr. Larry Bland, editor of the papers of George Catlett Marshall, asked Pogue directly on two separate occasions whether Marshall kept such a book, Pogue confirmed that he did not. Pogue admitted he'd repeated the myth when it was presumed real, said he was sorry he'd included it in his writing because it gave the story authority it didn't deserve. What Marshall actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his career, he'd observed officers at key vantage points. At Fort Benning, where he served as assistant commandant from 1927 to 1932, he'd watched hundreds of officers teach, learn, and lead. In China, in Washington, in various staff positions, he'd noted who showed initiative and who waited for orders, who could think clearly under pressure and who froze, who could inspire men, and who merely commanded them. The list of promising officers existed entirely in his mind. He could recall conversations from years earlier, impressions formed in passing, potential glimpsed in a single exercise or staff meeting. This mental catalog, accumulated over decades, would determine who led American forces into battle. During his years at Fort Benning, approximately 150 future generals attended the infantry school. About 50 served on the faculty. Marshall watched them all, assigned them challenging problems, observed how they responded, noted who asked the right questions and who accepted easy answers. These officers became known as the Marshall Men. Their careers would accelerate dramatically once Marshall gained power to promote them. The selection of Dwight Eisenhower demonstrated Marshall's methods in action. Their first meaningful contact came in 1930. Marshall was impressed by a young major working on the American Battlefield Monuments Commission staff who'd helped General Pershing revise his memoirs. The work required tact, intelligence, and the ability to manage a difficult superior. Marshall noted these qualities, remembered the young officer's name. Marshall offered Eisenhower a position on the Fort Benning faculty. Eisenhower politely declined. He already had orders for a coveted general staff assignment in Washington. The refusal didn't offend Marshall. If anything, it demonstrated that Eisenhower could make decisions and stick to them. Their paths crossed again at the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Eisenhower was then a lieutenant colonel, serving as chief of staff for Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army. His performance caught Marshall's attention. Eisenhower had helped plan operations that consistently outmaneuvered the opposing force. His staff work was meticulous, but not rigid. When plans needed to change, he changed them. The pivotal moment came December 14th, 1941, exactly 1 week after Pearl Harbor. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington. Eisenhower flew from Fort Sam Houston in Texas, arrived exhausted after delays and bad weather. It was the first time he'd spoken to Marshall for more than 2 minutes. Marshall presented a grim overview of the situation in the Pacific. The Philippines, where Eisenhower had served 4 years under MacArthur, were under attack. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia. The strategic situation appeared desperate. Then Marshall posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower asked for a few hours in a desk. Marshall provided both. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum. It acknowledged the Philippines couldn't be saved, but argued they couldn't be abandoned either. The United States had to make every effort to support the defenders, even if the effort was ultimately futile, because abandoning them would destroy American credibility with allies throughout the Pacific. He recommended building up Australia as a base for Pacific operations. This analysis became the core Pacific strategy. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly what Marshall wanted to see. Eisenhower hadn't asked for more information, hadn't requested a committee to study the problem, hadn't hedged his conclusions with qualifications. He'd analyzed the situation, reached a decision, presented a clear recommendation. Marshall's response revealed his philosophy. Eisenhower, the department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but feel always compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Eisenhower had passed the test. Marshall assigned him to the War Plans Division, overseeing the Philippines and Far East. By February 1942, just 2 months later, Eisenhower was chief of the entire War Plans Division. His subsequent rise was the fastest of any general in World War II. From lieutenant colonel in December 1941, he became a 5-star general of the Army by December 1944, a promotion that came just 4 days after Marshall himself received his 5th star. George Patton presented a different kind of challenge. Marshall had known Patton since World War I, had renewed the friendship at Fort Myer in late 1938, when Patton commanded the 3rd Cavalry. The two men were a study in contrasts. Marshall was reserved, methodical, self-effacing. Patton was flamboyant, impulsive, utterly convinced of his own destiny. Marshall regarded Patton as the Allies' best fighting general, but recognized he required management. Patton needs a break to slow him down, Marshall observed, because he is apt to coast at breakneck speed, propelled by his enthusiasm and exuberance. Catherine Marshall, the general's wife, once told Patton he couldn't talk the way he did. "George, you say these outrageous things, and then you look at me to see if I am going to smile. A general cannot talk in any such wild way." At 54 years old, Patton fell into the category of officers who might have been pushed aside under Marshall's age standards. He survived the plucking board's review only because he demonstrated the energy and drive of a much younger man. His performance in the Louisiana maneuvers proved that age hadn't diminished his capabilities. Marshall elevated Patton from colonel in July 1938 to 4-star general by April 1945. The journey between those ranks was tumultuous. Patton's mouth got him into trouble repeatedly. His actions sometimes bordered on insubordination. But Marshall protected him because he recognized Patton was irreplaceable. Twice during the war, Marshall intervened to save Patton's career. In Sicily, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The incident became a scandal when reporters learned of it. Eisenhower, who commanded the Mediterranean theater, considered sending Patton home in disgrace. Marshall counseled patience. Patton was too valuable to lose. After the Knutsford affair in England, when Patton made impolitic remarks suggesting the United States and Britain would rule the post-war world with no mention of the Soviet Union, Marshall again protected him. The incident nearly cost Patton his command on the eve of the Normandy invasion. Marshall's intervention kept him in place. Omar Bradley represented yet another path to high command. He'd served as a tactics instructor at Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure as assistant commandant. The two men had worked closely together. Marshall had observed Bradley's teaching methods, his treatment of students, his approach to military problems. Marshall described Bradley as quiet, unassuming, capable, with sound common sense. These weren't flashy qualities, but they were the qualities Marshall valued most. Bradley didn't seek attention, didn't promote himself, simply did his job with steady competence. Bradley later wrote that no man had a greater influence on him personally or professionally than George Marshall. The relationship shaped Bradley's entire career and his approach to command. Bradley rose from brigadier general in February 1941 to 4-star general and commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. More than 1.3 million soldiers served under his command during the campaigns in France and Germany. He would later become the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. a position that placed him at the pinnacle of the American military establishment. Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe for his sharp tongue and acid personality, impressed Marshall so deeply that Marshall held open the position of Chief of the Tactical Section at Fort Benning for a full year until Stilwell became available. Other officers wanted the job. Marshall waited for the man he wanted. Marshall called Stilwell, possessed of a genius for instruction, and one of the exceptionally brilliant and cultured men of the Army. The description of Stilwell as cultured might have surprised those who knew only his crusty exterior. But Stilwell spoke Chinese fluently, had studied Chinese history and literature, understood Asia better than almost any American officer of his generation. When Marshall needed someone to handle the impossible China assignment that Drum had rejected, Stilwell was his choice. The mission proved every bit as difficult as Drum had feared. Stilwell fought with Chiang Kai-shek, clashed with the British, watched his forces suffer repeated defeats. But he never quit, never asked to be relieved, did exactly what Marshall had asked of him. The roster of commanders Marshall identified and elevated reads like a history of American victory in World War II. Mark Clark led the Fifth Army in Italy. Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army in Europe. Jacob Devers led the Sixth Army Group in the invasion of southern France. J. Lawton Collins became one of the most aggressive corps commanders in the European theater. Lucian Truscott led divisions and corps in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Matthew Ridgway commanded airborne forces in Normandy and later led the 18th Airborne Corps. Walter Kruger directed the 6th Army across the Pacific. These men led American forces from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of Germany, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Philippines and beyond. They defeated two of the most formidable military powers in history. Simultaneously, the consequences of Marshall's reforms became clear when American forces were measured against armies that hadn't undergone similar transformation. France offered the most devastating contrast. When Germany attacked in May 1940, the French army possessed more tanks than the Wehrmacht, had adequate manpower, approximately 5 million men under arms. Its defensive fortifications along the Maginot Line were engineering marvels that represented the most sophisticated military construction of the age. French tanks were often superior to their German counterparts. The Char B-1 heavy tank outgunned and outarmored anything Germany fielded in 1940. French artillery was excellent. French soldiers were brave and reasonably well trained. On paper, France should have been able to resist the German onslaught. But French leadership was aged, rigid, trapped in patterns of the previous war. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was 67 years old during the campaign. He'd established his headquarters at the Château de Vincennes, a medieval fortress without modern communications equipment. The headquarters had no radio. Orders traveled by motorcycle courier, a method that belonged to 1914, not 1940. The choice of headquarters revealed Gamelin's mindset. He'd fought World War I from similar fortified positions, believed that command meant being physically secure while issuing carefully considered orders based on complete information. The idea of commanding from mobile headquarters closer to the battle never occurred to him. Gamelin had decreed in 1935 that the High Command was the sole arbiter for doctrine. All articles, lectures, and books by serving officers required approval before publication. This effectively stifled innovation, ensured that French military thinking remained frozen in the patterns of World War I. One French officer, Charles de Gaulle, had written a book advocating for mobile armored warfare, argued that France needed mechanized divisions that could move rapidly and strike deep. Gamelin and the French High Command rejected these ideas. De Gaulle's career suffered because he dared to question established doctrine. Officers who questioned the Maginot Line strategy risked their careers. Officers who suggested that the Ardennes forest might be passable to German armor were dismissed as alarmists. The French command structure rewarded conformity and punished innovation. When the Germans punched through the Ardennes forest, an area Gamelin had left defended by only 10 reserve divisions because he considered it impassable to armor, the French command structure collapsed. The German breakthrough came on May 13, 1940, 3 days after the invasion began. By May 15th, German panzers had advanced 40 miles into France. French reserve divisions disintegrated. Communication networks failed. Supply lines were cut. Gamelin sat in what observers called tragic immobility, unable to issue decisive orders as his armies disintegrated. The speed of the German advance overwhelmed a command system designed for the deliberate pace of trench warfare. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, was 73 years old, even older than Gamelin. Weygand arrived May 19th, 9 days after the German attack began, when the breakthrough was already complete. Within a week, he was displaying pessimism that could have been interpreted as defeatism. Weygand's age showed immediately. He couldn't work the long hours the crisis demanded, needed rest, couldn't process information quickly enough to respond to German movements. By the time he made decisions, the tactical situation had already changed. The battle was lost before he could influence it. France fell in 6 weeks. Approximately 60,000 French soldiers died between May and June 1940. Over 1.5 million were captured. The Fourth Republic collapsed. France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. The cause wasn't lack of courage among the troops or shortage of equipment. French soldiers fought bravely in many engagements. French tanks were often superior to their German counterparts. French artillery was excellent. The material was adequate. The cause was leadership that couldn't adapt to the speed and violence of modern warfare. Leadership selected through seniority rather than capability. Leadership that had spent decades preparing for the previous war rather than the next one. Britain fared only marginally better in the early years of the war. The British officer corps maintained a rigid class-based selection system in which 89% of officer candidates at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1939 came from expensive private schools. The system produced capable administrators but discouraged the kind of aggressive initiative that modern warfare demanded. British officers were gentlemen first, soldiers second. Social connections mattered more than tactical skill. An officer who'd attended the right schools and belonged to the right clubs could expect advancement regardless of actual capability. This system worked adequately for colonial policing and garrison duty. But it failed catastrophically when British forces faced the Wehrmacht. In France, in 1940, British divisions fought bravely, but were outmaneuvered by faster-moving German formations. British commanders couldn't match the pace of German operations, couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing tactical situations, couldn't coordinate effectively with French forces. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk in June 1940. About 340,000 soldiers escaped, but they left behind nearly all their heavy equipment, every tank, most artillery, thousands of vehicles. In North Africa, British forces initially performed poorly against smaller German formations. British commanders were cautious, methodical, reluctant to take risks. German commanders were aggressive, opportunistic, willing to exploit success ruthlessly. It took 3 years of defeats before Britain began serious reforms. The General Service Corps scheme, which attempted to broaden the base of officer recruitment, wasn't introduced until July 1942, nearly 3 years after the war began. Even then, the reforms were modest. British officer culture remained largely intact. Social class continued to influence promotions. Old boy networks continued to matter. The changes came too slowly to transform the Army before American forces became dominant in the Allied coalition. The Soviet Union faced different problems, but with similar results. Stalin's purges of the Red Army between 1937 and 1941 had destroyed Soviet military leadership. Approximately 30,000 officers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. This included 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 Army commanders, 57 of 85 Corps commanders, and 110 of 195 division commanders. The purge removed experienced leadership and replaced it with politically reliable officers who often lacked tactical skill. Competence mattered less than loyalty to Stalin. Officers who showed independent thinking were suspect. Those who questioned orders risked arrest. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Soviet forces outnumbered the Wehrmacht, had more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery. But Soviet leadership was incompetent. Commanders who'd been promoted after the purges couldn't coordinate large formations, couldn't respond to German movements, couldn't adapt their tactics to match German combined arms operations. The results were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army lost approximately 4.5 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The Germans advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. Soviet performance improved only after surviving officers gained combat experience, and Stalin reluctantly gave them more tactical authority. But the learning process took years and cost millions of lives. Germany, ironically, had a more merit-based officer evaluation system than either France or Britain. German officers were rated in 7 categories, ranging from suitable for Wehrmacht high command to already unsuitable for current position. Junior officers could command battle groups over their seniors based on tactical necessity. This flexibility, combined with a doctrine that emphasized initiative at all levels, gave the German army decisive advantages in the early years of the war. German promotion system rewarded aggressiveness and tactical skill. Officers who demonstrated competence in combat advanced rapidly, regardless of seniority. This meant German units at all levels were led by officers who'd proven themselves under fire. But German flexibility had limits. Adolf Hitler increasingly interfered with military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders who disagreed with the Führer risked their careers and sometimes their lives. By 1942, Hitler was making strategic decisions that professional military officers knew were disastrous. The order to hold Stalingrad at all costs, the refusal to allow tactical withdrawals, the insistence on operations that had no chance of success. German officers couldn't challenge these orders without risking execution. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The Wehrmacht's officer corps, for all its tactical excellence, couldn't overcome strategic incompetence at the highest level. Marshall's reforms avoided both the French problem of gerontocracy and the German problem of dictatorial interference. He removed officers who couldn't adapt to modern warfare, but he also created a system where successful commanders could make decisions without constant interference from Washington. Once Marshall selected officers for combat commands, he gave them authority to conduct operations as they saw fit, didn't micromanage, didn't second-guess tactical decisions, trusted the commanders he'd selected to use their judgment. This combination, selecting capable leaders and then trusting them, proved decisive. American commanders made mistakes, but they learned from them, adapted their tactics, improved their performance over time, and they did so at a pace that armies with more rigid systems couldn't match. Marshall's critics charged that he was destroying institutional memory, throwing away decades of accumulated experience, promoting untested men over proven leaders. Service. Newspapers accused him of getting rid of all the brains of the army. Marshall's response was characteristically dry. I could not reply that I was eliminating considerable arterial sclerosis. Congressional opposition centered on National Guard generals with political connections. The Guard was deeply intertwined with state politics. Guard generals often owed their positions to governors and legislators rather than military merit. When politicians questioned his efforts to replace Guard Division leadership, Marshall's response was blunt. I am not going to leave him in command of that division, so I will put it to you this way. If he stays, I go, and if I stay, he goes. The politician backed down. Marshall's willingness to stake his position on personnel decisions gave him leverage that few chiefs of staff had possessed. When Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter passed along criticism from a friend in the Army Reserve, Marshall replied tartly, "Most of our senior officers on such duty are deadwood and should be eliminated from the service as rapidly as possible." He didn't soften his views for friends of the powerful. The opposition never stopped Marshall because he possessed something his critics lacked: the absolute confidence of President Roosevelt. The president had selected Marshall over 33 more senior officers precisely because he recognized in Marshall the moral courage to make hard decisions. Roosevelt backed his chief of staff consistently, even when the political costs were significant. Marshall's selections weren't infallible. He made mistakes, and he learned from them. He was especially fond of Lloyd Friedendahl, called him one of the best, remarked that you could see determination all over his face. Friedendahl commanded the largest task force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Friedendahl proved disastrous. His command post was located 70 miles behind the front lines in an elaborate underground bunker that his engineers had spent weeks constructing, while combat units needed their skills elsewhere. He issued confusing orders using a personal code that his subordinates couldn't understand. When German forces attacked, American units were positioned poorly and coordinated worse. The result was the worst American defeat of the European War. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. German commanders who'd wondered whether American troops could fight concluded that their doubts had been confirmed. Both Marshall and Eisenhower came to regret the Friedendahl selection, but the system Marshall had created allowed for correction. Friedendahl was relieved and replaced by Patton, who transformed the defeated corps into a fighting force within weeks. The ability to remove failing commanders without destroying their careers or creating political crisis was itself a product of Marshall's reforms. Friedendahl wasn't disgraced. He was sent back to the United States to train new troops, a position where his organizational skills could be useful without the pressures of combat command. His experience, even failed experience, wasn't wasted. During the war, 16 Army Division commanders were relieved for cause, along with at least 5 Corps commanders. Critically, the system permitted second chances. At least 5 generals who were relieved of combat command were later given another division to lead. Orlando Ward commanded the 20th Armored Division in 1945 after being relieved earlier in the war. Terry Allen led the 104th Infantry Division through the end of the war after his removal from the 1st Infantry Division. This flexibility distinguished the American approach from both the German and British systems. German commanders who failed were often shot or imprisoned. British commanders who failed were rarely given second opportunities. The American system treated failure as information rather than disgrace, allowed the Army to learn from mistakes rather than simply punish them. The transformation Marshall achieved can be measured in numbers. When he took command in September 1939, the Army had fewer than 190,000 soldiers organized into 6 divisions. Only 4 in the continental United States, 1 in Hawaii, 1 in the Philippines. By the end of 1940, the number had grown to 269,000. By the end of 1941, it exceeded 1.4 million. By 1943, nearly 7 million. At its peak in March 1945, the United States Army numbered more than 8 million soldiers, organized into 91 divisions. This expansion required a corresponding increase in officers. Men who'd been lieutenants in 1940 were colonels by 1944. The bottleneck that had strangled careers for 2 decades was shattered by the demands of global war. The young officers Marshall had identified and protected now led divisions and corps into battle. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force Marshall had inherited 5 years earlier. American soldiers crossed the English Channel in landing craft, designed and built in American shipyards, were supported by aircraft manufactured in American factories, carried weapons produced by an industrial mobilization that had transformed the American economy. But equipment alone didn't win battles. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, and tested by the system Marshall created. They'd survived the plucking board. They'd proven themselves in maneuvers and in combat. They were the best officers the American military could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called Marshall the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared that our army and people have never been so indebted to any soldier. Harry Truman said simply that millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. George C. Marshall gave it victory. Time magazine named Marshall Man of the Year twice, in 1943 and 1947. He became the first and only career soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded in 1953 for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the war. He served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only person in American history to hold both positions. The officers Marshall removed faded into obscurity. Their names appear in no histories of the war. Their contributions, whatever they might have been, remained unmade. Some accepted their fate with dignity, understanding that the mission was greater than any individual career. Others harbored resentment for the rest of their lives, never accepting that their time had passed. The officers Marshall promoted became legends. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States. Bradley became a 5-star general and the most respected military figure of the post-war era. Patton died in a car accident just months after the German surrender, but his name became synonymous with aggressive leadership. The Marshall Men shaped American military doctrine and defense policy for a generation after the war ended. Marshall himself sought no glory. When Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman became president, many assumed Marshall would receive command of the invasion of Japan or some other prestigious assignment. Instead, Marshall remained in Washington, coordinating the global war effort from his desk. When Eisenhower was selected to command the Normandy invasion, a position Marshall had wanted, he accepted the decision without complaint. Truman offered Marshall the chance to become the military governor of Germany after the war. Marshall declined. He'd seen enough of war, wanted to go home to his garden in Leesburg, Virginia, spend time with his wife, Catherine. But retirement proved impossible. Truman needed him in China as special envoy. Then as Secretary of State. Then as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. Marshall served until his health failed, always answering when his country called. The lesson of Marshall's officer purge extends beyond military affairs. Organizations of all kinds face the same challenge he confronted. How do you remove people who've done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions? How do you make room for new talent when existing leaders have earned their places through years of faithful service? How do you balance loyalty to individuals against responsibility to the institution? Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, personal friendships, political connections, none of these could be allowed to outweigh current capability. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Men would die if leaders couldn't lead. Marshall stated his philosophy in words that deserve to be remembered. The truly great leader overcomes all difficulties. Campaigns and battles are nothing but a long series of difficulties to be overcome. The lack of equipment, the lack of food, the lack of this or that are only excuses. The real leader displays his quality in his triumphs over adversity, however great it may be. He had another saying that captured his approach to selecting leaders. If leadership depends purely on seniority, you are defeated before you start. You give a good leader very little, and he will succeed. You give mediocrity a great deal, and they will fail. This principle, demanding excellence, accepting no excuses, measuring leaders by results, transformed an army ranked 19th in the world into the force that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, September 1st, 1939, the day Marshall took his oath. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor attacked. The 27 months between those dates were critical, the time when Marshall purged the deadwood, identified the talent, built the leadership structure that would win the war. If Marshall had waited until after Pearl Harbor to begin his reforms, it would have been too late. The officers he removed would have been commanding divisions when American soldiers first met the Wehrmacht in North Africa. The inexperienced lieutenants he promoted would not have had time to learn their jobs before lives depended on their decisions. The war in North Africa demonstrated what Marshall's reforms had accomplished. When American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, they were led by officers Marshall had selected and promoted. Major General George Patton commanded the Western Task Force that landed in Morocco. Patton had been a colonel just 4 years earlier. Marshall had promoted him over dozens of more senior officers because he'd recognized Patton's aggressive instinct and tactical brilliance. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded Second Corps. Fredendall would prove to be one of Marshall's few mistakes, would be relieved after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. But the system Marshall created allowed for that correction without destroying the Army's effectiveness. Major General Terry Allen commanded the 1st Infantry Division. Allen was unconventional, difficult to manage, prone to insubordination. But Marshall had recognized his combat capability and given him a division despite his personality flaws. These were men Marshall had observed, evaluated, and promoted based on their demonstrated ability to lead in combat-like conditions. Not on their seniority, not on their connections, not on their ability to navigate peacetime Army politics. The first American engagements in North Africa revealed gaps in training and equipment. American tanks were inferior to German panzers. American tactics were untested. Coordination between units was poor, but the leadership proved adaptable. American commanders learned from defeats, adjusted tactics, improved coordination. Within months, American forces were performing at levels that matched or exceeded their German opponents. This adaptation was possible because Marshall had selected officers capable of learning, officers who could admit mistakes, officers who could change their approaches when initial plans failed, officers who placed mission success above personal pride. By 1943, American forces were driving German and Italian forces out of North Africa, were preparing for the invasions of Sicily and Italy, were demonstrating capabilities that astonished both allies and enemies. British commanders who'd been skeptical of American military capability revised their assessments. German commanders who dismissed American soldiers as soft and poorly led discovered they'd underestimated their opponents. The transformation from the Louisiana maneuvers to victory in North Africa took less than 2 years. An army that had been 19th in the world in 1939 was defeating the Wehrmacht by 1943. Marshall's reforms made that transformation possible, not the equipment, not the industrial production, not the numbers, the leadership, officers who could adapt to modern warfare, who could learn from combat, who could inspire soldiers to fight effectively against experienced enemies. The same pattern repeated in the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur commanded Southwest Pacific Forces. Walter Kruger commanded 6th Army. Robert Eichelberger commanded 8th Army. Joseph Stilwell commanded forces in China, Burma, India. These officers had all been identified by Marshall as capable of high command. All had demonstrated tactical skill and strategic vision. All proved themselves in combat against Japanese forces that had spent years fighting in China and had conquered most of Southeast Asia in less than 6 months. American forces in the Pacific faced different challenges than in Europe. Jungle warfare required different tactics. Island hopping required different logistics. Coordinating naval and ground operations required different skills. But the officers Marshall selected adapted, learned jungle tactics, mastered amphibious operations, coordinated with Navy commanders, developed innovative approaches to problems the Army had never faced before. By 1945, American forces had driven Japanese forces back across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, had recaptured the Philippines, were preparing for the invasion of Japan itself. The victory was won by multiple factors: industrial production, naval superiority, air power, logistics, intelligence. But underlying all of these was leadership. Officers who could coordinate complex operations across vast distances, who could maintain offensive momentum despite enormous logistical challenges, who could inspire soldiers to keep fighting through campaigns that lasted months or years. Marshall had selected these officers, had given them their chances, had trusted them to perform. His judgment proved correct more often than not. The cost of his mistakes was real. Fredendall's failure at Kasserine Pass cost lives. Other relieved. Commanders had wasted time and resources before being replaced. The system wasn't perfect, but perfection wasn't required. The system just needed to identify capable leadership more often than it failed, needed to allow corrections when mistakes were made, needed to promote officers based on capability rather than seniority. Marshall's system accomplished all of this, and in doing so, created the generation of commanders who won World War II. The post-war assessment confirmed what Marshall had accomplished. American forces had defeated enemies on 3 continents, had liberated occupied nations across Europe and Asia, had destroyed 2 of the most formidable military powers in history. The victory cost enormous resources. Over 400,000 American soldiers died. Millions more were wounded. The financial cost exceeded $300 billion, roughly equivalent to $4 trillion in modern dollars. But the strategic result was total victory. Unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945. Unconditional surrender of Japan in August 1945. The creation of a post-war order dominated by democratic nations rather than totalitarian empires. Marshall's contribution to this victory was selecting the officers who made it possible. Eisenhower coordinating Allied forces across Europe, Bradley commanding the largest American field force in history, Patton driving through France and Germany, MacArthur accepting Japan's surrender aboard USS Missouri. These men led because Marshall had identified their potential years earlier, had promoted them over more senior officers, had given them opportunities to prove themselves, had trusted his judgment about capability over conventional measures of qualification. The 600 officers Marshall fired never commanded troops in combat. Their names are forgotten. Their potential contributions, if any, were never made. But their removal made space for the officers who won. And that was the point. Marshall wasn't trying to be fair, wasn't trying to respect tradition, wasn't trying to make everyone happy. He was trying to win the war, and he understood that winning required putting the most capable officers in positions where they could make a difference. Everything else was secondary. The lesson extends beyond World War II, beyond military affairs. Organizations of all types face Marshall's challenge. How do you identify genuine capability? How do you distinguish between officers who look impressive on paper and officers who can actually perform? How do you remove people who've done nothing wrong except fail to meet demands they were never designed to meet? How do you balance loyalty to individuals against responsibility to the mission? Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, personal friendships, political connections, none of these can be allowed to outweigh current capability. The mission is too important. The stakes are too high. People will die if leaders can't lead. This approach requires moral courage, requires willingness to make enemies, requires accepting that you'll be criticized for decisions that can't be explained without destroying individuals' reputations. Marshall possessed that courage, made those hard decisions, accepted the criticism, trusted that results would vindicate his judgment, and they did. The army he rebuilt saved the world. Not an exaggeration. If Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had won World War II, human history would have taken a catastrophically different path. Democracy would have been suppressed. Entire populations would have been enslaved or exterminated. The post-war world of relative peace and prosperity would never have existed. Marshall prevented that outcome, not alone, not single-handedly, but his reforms were essential to American victory. Without capable leadership, American industrial production would have been wasted. Without aggressive commanders, American soldiers would have been defeated despite numerical and material advantages. Marshall provided the leadership that made victory possible, and he did so by making decisions in peacetime that prepared the army for war. September 1st, 1939. A 58-year-old general takes his oath wearing a white civilian suit, inherits an army ranked 19th in the world, an army with aged leadership and broken promotion systems, an army unprepared for modern warfare. 27 months later, December 7th, 1941, that same general commands an army with young, aggressive leaders. Officers selected for capability rather than seniority. Commanders prepared to adapt to the demands of mechanized warfare. The transformation happened because Marshall had the moral courage to fire 600 officers who'd done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions, and saved America in World War II.